Hi, welcome. Sorry about that.
Okay. Can you guys all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Do you want me to just get started with the financials?
Yes.
Okay,
You probably can.
Yes.
Because I'm not on.
Can you hear us?
I can.
Well, you can't unmute somebody that's not in the meeting though. I'm like,
You're all
I'm
right.
not in.
Okay, let me start this from the beginning. Okay, can you guys see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, so I went down the list of questions and I thought the best thing was to give you a little financial overview and let you make sure you can ask questions along the way. And that will be, I don't want to go forward and then lose you along the way because I know financials are not the most exciting presentation. So let me go through some of this. So a couple of the first questions were about who did the analysis. And so the city of Beaver Falls about a year ago solicited proposals under the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania's it's the Strategic Management Planning Program. And part of it included a complete analysis of all the financials, the financial condition. So we reviewed everything, looked at 5 years worth of material. We did some projections 5 years forward. We were selected, so the program basically developed for communities that are experiencing or beginning to experience financial difficulty. We were selected, we've done at least a dozen of these. I also work with a couple, 47 communities and have been in the business in local government and local government finance for over 30 years, just so you know who we are and what we do. So I work with only local governments. That's sort of my thing. So some of the background information, just so that you get a picture of some of the things we looked at. We looked at the demographics, and this is sort of a list of those demographics. So almost 16% of the population is 65 years of age or older. 19.3% of the families in Beaver Falls are below the poverty level. So that's a higher poverty level than the county, state, and national averages. The median household income is about $36,368. These are 2018 numbers, which are the last numbers that are available through the census. Educational attainment for high school degrees is 85.8%, which is lower than the county, but about the same as the state and national averages. The combined millage rate, and this is 2018, and I actually have some updated information for you because the city actually raised their taxes in 2019. So the combined, the school districts are 68 and the municipalities are 34 mills. The rest is county millage. The city lost, and that's going to become important because some of the questions are, can we, what can we do as a home rule as opposed to a third-class city? And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. So the city lost, in those 5 years or so, lost over 1,600 jobs. And then we looked at the opportunities for revenue generation. So the average real estate tax bill in the city is almost $2,000. And that is lower than other cities of similar size, which I'm going to show you in a minute, a chart. It's also 5.5% of the median household income. So Beaver Falls residents are basically paying about 5.5% of their household income for real estate taxes. And we use that as a comparison to other communities. The countywide reassessment eventually will allow for lower millage rates. That was one of the questions on the sheet that was sent to me. So basically, when the county reassesses, and I'm not sure when that will be. Michael may know more than I do, but they had appealed a decision to Commonwealth Court and they lost that decision. And I think they have been ordered to actually conduct a reassessment. And I'm not sure if they have actually begun to look at that or consider that or have a time frame or schedule. So Michael, I don't know if you know any more than I do about that.
You're referring to the Beaver County
Yes,
reassessment. I believe that it's going to take place. I'm just not sure where it is in the process.
okay, that's what yeah, that was what I knew. I wasn't sure that if they had set out a timetable.
I've not heard of one yet.
Some of the other opportunities, of course, everybody talks about the Shell cracker plant and the jobs and opportunities that might present. And of course, the whole home rule charter process provides more flexibility in taxing authority, which makes it there's more flexibility and ability to spread the taxing pain, for lack of a better term, across different populations. This is the real estate tax burden, and I think it's kind of interesting. What we did was we looked at the median tax bill for Beaver Falls. So we took a median assessed value, looked at the local, county, and school district taxes, applied that to the typical assessment. And as I said, it's about $2,000. It's $1,928. And then we looked at that in terms of your median income. So, and we looked at other communities of similar size and that are, basically similar and third-class cities. And we looked at whether or not they were paying similar tax bills and what percentage of the median income was being addressed. And you can see that Beaver Falls pays about 5.5%. And some of them are a little bit lower, but several of them are higher. So it's right in the mix, sort of an average amount of tax burden on Beaver Falls residents.
Does Aliquippa still have a blended rate or not?
Yes, they do have a blended rate, but yeah, we adjusted for that. So basically, the Aliquippa is really at 30 mils. It's just adjusted so that it's higher on land than it is on buildings. Yeah, they do have a blended rate, but their millage rate is 30 mils.
The percentages you have all listed here, are they
Yes.
reflective of the new tax millage? I'm sorry, the changes that were made in 2019?
No, we did these calculations and these comparisons in 2018.
Okay.
So yeah, it's been adjusted. The 2 mils were added in 2019.
So the percentage, it's not, it would all look different.
It would go up slightly. Yes, it would.
Okay, thank you.
And the reason we use 2018 is that that's the latest population median income that we can get from the census. So we try to keep it consistent across all the categories. But you're right, it's a moving target and it does change. This just gives you sort of a snapshot of what it looked like at that particular point in time.
Debbie, just real quick, go back to page 3. How did you determine that the city lost 1,600 jobs?
That again was from the census, and there's a lot more detail on exactly where the city lost and gained in different segments. And I'd be happy to send that out to you, but there's a complete segment based on the census data. And again, it's hard to get current data. That's why we looked at, like 2005 to 2018, because there's always lag time in between when they actually get that data and then report it. And in fact, now it's almost impossible to get data because they're working on the 2020 census. So it's really hard. They haven't been updating the material as often. So, I mean, again, these are not absolute numbers. It just sort of gives you an idea of how it's trending.
Am I allowed to ask a question, a non-commissioned member right now, or is there a time for that? Or?
Sure.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit more about the expected effect of the county reassessment?
Sure. So I've been through a couple of these. I've been through Allegheny counties, Lawrence counties, and Washington counties. And so I can tell you generally what happens. Generally speaking, the assessments all go up because they haven't been done in, 30 or 40 years typically. So the assessments all go up. Now, everything's not going to go up equally because some properties have increased in value a lot more than other properties. So the commercial and industrial may not go up as high as some residential. Some residential may go up higher than others, but it will be based on, if it's done correctly, it should be based on actual market values and, a blending of current sales and market values. So it should come closer to reflect the market values of homes in Beaver Falls and in Beaver County. What that does is once the assessments all go up, your millage rates will go down. And I always use the example of when I was the manager in Dormont Borough, when Allegheny County did theirs, our millage rate was actually at about 45 mills because we had a lot of special millage that we had applied because it had been so long since the county had done a reassessment. Our millage rate actually went down to like 7.5 mills. I know in, Washington County, there were, lots of municipalities that were at their maximum taxing authority that they actually had to reduce their millage to, 2 or 3 or 5 mills of tax. There is a limit on the first year after an assessment. You're not allowed to have a huge windfall. So for instance, if a community said, well, we're just going to leave our millage where it is, that's against the law. You actually can only collect 5% more than you collected the year before they implemented the new assessments. You're allowed to collect more revenue. You're allowed to collect 5% more, but you are not allowed to set your millage rate so that you get a huge windfall in the year after a reassessment occurs. Usually takes them about 2 years or maybe even a little longer to do the assessment. And then it usually is almost another year before they roll out those numbers because they have to roll them out, and everybody has to see what those numbers look like. Now, one of the things that happens, and I always warn municipalities about this, the first year after a reassessment, you get a huge number of assessment appeals because you figure some of these assessed values are $10,000 and $15,000 because they were done 30 years ago or 40 years ago. And when you get your new assessment, all of a sudden you see 40 or 50 or 60,000 as your new assessment. So one of the things that the counties have to plan for is that a lot of residents, a lot of commercial, a lot of industrial properties will probably file tax appeals, and some will be successful. Some will not, some will be successful. So what you have to do is and it's very, very tough to estimate exactly what you're going to bring in. And then I always say, make sure that you plan for refunding a certain percentage of the taxes too, because if you lose the tax appeal, they still have to pay it, but they're allowed to pay it under protest. You have to escrow it, and if they win their appeal, you have to give them their money back. So it's a real tricky thing when they're actually doing these assessments. I don't know, Michael, if you have anything to add to that, but that's been my experience over the years in these things.
Well, what I've seen when a countywide reassessment goes into effect is that municipalities are challenged to establish a millage rate that's lower based upon the new values. And again, the first year it goes into effect, the revenue received cannot be greater than 10% of what was received in the year before the reassessment went into effect. The point I'm making is that appeals are going on during the new year where it went into effect, and the municipalities have ended up giving refunds on successful assessment appeals that they have no idea what the budget for and how much will actually be refunded. So in order for a countywide reassessment to really be effective and to go in effect on a timely basis, all of the major assessment appeals need to be resolved so that the municipalities are working with a accurate value of properties so that they're not getting a deluge and a plethora of assessment appeals where they have to give out refunds after the fact.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. And I've seen some communities lower their millage too low and not collect what they thought they were going to collect. And then, as Michael said, you end up giving back some of that money. So it's a really tricky business to try and figure out exactly where your millage rate needs to be. And then, you know, how much you're going to have to refund in those. Usually goes on for a couple of years that people will actually file appeals.
So you're saying it's probably a couple years until, no, I'm not even talking about once it's implemented and there's all the challenges, that's probably another couple years. But from, if they started doing the reassessment tomorrow, you said there'd still be a couple years until they were finished doing the reassessment, right?
Typically, yes, that's what I've seen, is it takes a couple years because remember, they have to look at whatever they usually contract this. They'll let a contract, they'll hire a company that specializes in this. And they're basically looking, maybe not at every property, but I know in Allegheny County's case, they did, because they took pictures of the properties, they entered information about every property. They, you know, assign values. They look at market sales. They build models to model what those, you know, assessments are going to look like. If they do a good job, they continuously then update so they don't go 20 or 30 or 40 years. You know, I think in Allegheny County, they do a third of the county every 3 years so that you don't end up with assessments that are out of date. So yeah, there's a lot that goes into it, depending on how many properties they have to look at. It usually takes 2 to 3 years. And then, like I said, you have this bit of uncertainty in the first year or two that they roll it out, where you're trying to figure out exactly what your millage rate should be. Anything else on the assessments? Okay, I'm going to move on right now to a lot of the questions that were asked were around the city's financial condition. And I tried to sort of distill this down so that we could look at the years and get a picture kind of where the city's been and what it looks like, you know, moving forward. So, so this basically, the screen that's up right now shows the year, what the fund balance was at the beginning of the year, what the fund balance was at the end of the year, and what the change was from the beginning to the end. So obviously, the negative numbers are in parentheses. The positive numbers are just showing up, you know, without the parentheses. So you can see, for instance, in 2013, the fund balance actually went up because the difference between revenue and expenditures was $200,000, $200,000 and $200,470. So the fund balance actually went up that year. So that was a positive year. And these are the first up through 2019 our audited numbers. So I took these directly from the city's audits, and then the last 4 years are projections. So you can see going through each of those years that then 2014, 15, and 16, instead of adding to the fund balance, the city was spending down its fund balance, because you had, what that means is that the expenditures exceeded the revenues by that number that's over on the right-hand side. So when expenditures exceed revenues by $278,051, then the fund balance goes down. And as you can see, if you look at all of these years through 2019, which are audited, you've got 4 years where the fund balance actually went down instead of up, until you get to 2018, where the city actually ended the year in a negative number, because there was a $757,000 difference between revenue and expenditures. So does that make sense to everyone before I go any further?
Is this just for general fund or all funds?
This is just the general fund right now, but that's where most of the activity takes place.
Right.
So there's like a sewer fund and some other funds that I didn't really prepare much on, but this is where all of the activity takes place for the most part.
I have another question about that is, so 2018, Deborah, you can correct me if I'm wrong, there would have been almost $1 million fund balance, except that $1 million was transferred to a pension fund. Is that correct?
No, actually, what we did was we added because just for consistency's sake, we added the pension numbers back in, even though they were in a separate fund, we added them back in so that it would be consistent. So the pension expenditures and revenue were actually included. And I'll show you that as we go forward, because I have separate revenue and expenditure charts. So no, the city actually ended up overspending that in that year. So if you look at 2017, for instance, it was almost a break-even year. I mean, $3,000 on an $8 or $9 million budget is, that's about as close as you can get. But then the following year, you spent that down pretty much. And if you look, I mean, over those 5 years or so, the city was pretty much spending that down almost every year. Every year you were spending down your cash reserves and your fund balance. In 2019, a couple things happened that I saw, and maybe some of you know more than I do. But one of the things was the city took out a loan of $600,000. And that was included in the proceeds from the loan are included in the general fund. That's part of that. And then the other thing that happened was the city raised taxes by 2 mils. So by injecting that 600, and actually the transfers from the sewer fund that year were higher than it had been in previous years. So by transferring more money from the sewer, the city sewer, and the joint sewer fund, by adding the 600,000 and by raising taxes by 2 mils, you were able then to get to a positive fund balance again that year. Does that make sense? And like I said, some of you may know more than I try to follow the dollars through the audits. So,
Just one comment on the pension expense. The
yes.
actual fund money that we collect is what gets paid into the pension funds.
Right.
Here, the Act 205 income exceeds the expense.
Right. And the thing about that is that it doesn't really affect, whether you include it in your general fund or you include it in a separate fund, it's a pass-through. Anything you collect on that goes into the pension fund, so it doesn't really hurt or help the general fund in any way, except that it does cover your pension and minimum municipal obligation. It covers that. Now it covers it. I think you had a little bit of a payment from the city, but for the most part, that $1 million that you collect on Act 2F5 covers your requirement every year. So, I'm sorry, go ahead.
The report, it says the Act 511 taxes were split and $1 million was moved to a separate pension EIT fund. That did not happen?
Yes, it did, but for purposes of this presentation, I put it back in, and you'll see why in a minute. Let me go through the revenue, and you'll see where it shows up. So, again, I did it for consistency's sake because it does look a little weird. So just in general, the revenue history, the city brings in about 8.7 million a year. Your revenue only goes up about 1% a year, and that is even when you know, with the tax increases, it still only goes up about 1%. 40% of all the revenue is from taxes, 32% is from transfers from the sewer funds, 5% is from fees. Act 511 taxes are really, and I'll show you those in a minute here, they're really very stable and they show consistent increases. Although they're slight increases, they do show increases. But the assessed values of property have declined, and the city at this point only gets about $50,000 on a mill of tax, and I'll show you that. These are the sources that I just went through. You can see real estate taxes and Act 511 taxes make up a big chunk, almost at 40%. The transfers are from some of the sewer user fees. The other types of revenue really don't make up a huge chunk of revenue. They're basically smaller pieces of it, important but smaller. So this is the revenue, and this is the reason I put the Act 205 back in so that you could look from year to year to year. So the transfers line item is where the Act 205 money shows up, and you can see that the transfers include that, and they in 2019 it was higher than usual, again because the 600,000 was transferred in from the debt. So there was $600,000 that was borrowed that was put into the general fund. But for the most part, again, your revenues are around 7.8, 8.2, but this one year in 2019 looks a little higher. And that's the reason, because the transfers were high and the proceeds were high from the loan. This shows you your real estate tax collection. And this is what I was saying. You only get about 50,000 on a mill of tax. And one of the unfortunate things, and this we reported to council in our presentation, is that the real estate collection rate, and I think it's on the next screen. So this is a lot of numbers basically for you to absorb, but if you go down to the last two columns or last two rows, the collection rate of taxes is only averages around 84%. That is not a very good collection rate. Most of the time you want to keep it at 90% or higher. So that was something that we talked to the city about, trying to figure that out and how we could get that collection rate up higher. You can see up here where it shows you that the millage is broken down into 3 different categories. So the general purpose millage is 24,5928. The debt service millage is 9.1747, and the recreation is smaller. It's only about 2 mils here. The total millage is 34 mils. Now, what else I'll say to you, because this is important, under the third class city code, you can only levy 30 mils and then 5 more mils with court approval. So you would have to go to court every year if you wanted to go beyond the 30 mils. And the city is at 24 point, let's say 0.6. I'm rounding it off, but 24.6 mils out of 30. Now the other millage, the debt service millage, the 9 mils is, that's unlimited because you are allowed to put as much millage as you need to pay your debt. You know, nobody wants any city to not be able to pay its debt. So the millage rate for debt is unlimited. And then you have, there is a limit on the recreation, but you're only at 0.24 or 0.25 mils for recreation. So a very small piece of the millage is directly related to recreation. So is there any question about that? I know that, so that's one of the things that when we talk about flexibility in taxing, that you definitely want to take into consideration, because the city is almost, they're at 24.6 mils and you only have 30 mils, and the mills only bring in $50,000 right now. Now when you have a reassessment, the mills will bring in a lot more per mill, but right now you're only bringing in, back to that other slide, you're only bringing in about $50,000 on 1 mil of tax.
These dollars aren't included in delinquent tax collection. but-
Yeah, no, they do not. My revenue numbers do include the delinquent, but when I do dollars per mill, it only includes the current, what you collect in a current year on one mil of tax.
So in effect, our collection rate's higher than 84%. It's just a question of cash flow.
Well, yeah, but when you turn it over to the Tax Claim Bureau, they have 3 years before they go after it. So in essence, this is your collection rate. And this is how we measure it for every community. Like I said, most communities are up around 90%. Some are as high as 95%. So this is a pretty low collection rate in the current year. Because what you don't collect gets turned over to the Tax Claim Bureau, and that may take 2 or 3 or more years to collect, if you're able to collect it.
What's our current millage again, please?
The current millage is 34, and the general purposes, I'm going to round these off. Well, I'll give you the numbers if you want. 24.5928 is the general purposes. And then debt service is 9.1747. And recreation is 0.2325.
So did you say that we could not go higher than 30 mils though, right?
The special millage doesn't count towards that threshold, but for general purposes, yes, 30 is your limit. Now you can go, and I'll double check this with Michael, but I think you can go 5 more mils with court approval. Is that correct, Michael?
Yes, that's correct. And it would have to be annual court approval,
Right. You have to go
Demonstrating-
every year. Right.
demonstrating to the court that you have a need and a necessity to increase the general purpose millage rate where there's no special purpose levies available, or you have, immediate or demanding circumstances that necessitate going higher. But once you hit 35 mils, you're capped out for general purposes under the third class city code.
So if we do go to the home rule charter, raising millage is not gonna, we won't be able to do that to generate revenue.
Yes, I'm sorry, go ahead, Michael.
If you go to home rule, all caps are removed for your real estate tax for general purposes, and all caps are removed for any special purpose levies that have a cap attached to it,
Okay,
such as street lighting, so to speak,
okay.
or like shade tree commission.
Right.
Those have caps, but home rule lifts those caps and gives you flexibility and latitude to use those millage rates, but you want to do it in juxtaposition, or you want to do it in relationship to what flexibility you also have with an earned income tax that I spoke about at the last meeting, where you want to balance out the ability to generate revenue between a real estate tax, which again is based on a fixed value of property, versus an earned income tax, which is based on income that is, I think, a better barometer of one's ability to pay, which normally goes up in some measurable degree year after year.
And I just put up on the screen the Act 511 taxes that we're talking about. So as Michael said, when you go to home rule, you can take the cap off the real estate tax, but you can also look at these taxes. Now, and I'll defer to Michael. Michael, on per capita and residence tax, those are each $5 per capita. Those stay intact, right? I don't think you have the ability to increase those, or do you?
My experience indicates that you do not.
So really what you're looking at is about halfway down this chart where it starts with the deed transfer tax. So currently, the city levies 0.5 on the realty transfer what we call deed transfer tax, and the school district levies 0.5. So you are at your maximum on that. But with home rule, you could increase that. You could take the limit off of the deed transfer tax. Right now, you cannot increase it. It is at its maximum. Similarly, the earned income tax, the city portion, you are capped at right now at 0.5, and the school district is at 0.5. So you are capped at that amount under Act 511, but under home rule, that cap could be removed. And that's what we've been talking about a lot. Everybody, I think, kind of realizes that. Now, the next line is Act 205 tax, and that is levied not under the third class city code, not under 511. It's actually under Act 205, which is a special authority, a special taxing authority for pensions that are in a distress. And yours, I just checked, actually yours got better this time. They just reported the 2020 report just came out August 31st, and the city actually went from a level 2 distress to a level 1 distress. So it's still considered just barely distressed because it's 89%, and 90 would be 0. It would not be in distress status anymore. But the city of Beaver Falls is still listed at minimally distressed, level score 1, which is level 1 distress, and you're 89% funded. So you're still allowed to levy that Act 205 because you're still considered a level 1 distress. But again, that money that's collected has to go directly to pensions. Now, the reason that is higher than the city portion, so if you look across the screen there, the city collects, in 2017, it was 567,000, went to 588,000, and then to 634,000. But the Act 205 is almost, not quite, but almost double. And that's because you're allowed to collect that not only on residents, you're allowed to collect that on non-residents. So the Act 205 actually generates a lot more revenue than the city portion because it is on residents and non-residents. And if you would take off the caps in a home rule charter on the city portion, you would still only be allowed to levy that on residents. You would not be allowed to levy that because the home rule charter specifically has language in it, or the home rule charter law specifically has language in it that says you can only raise those limits on residents, not on non-residents.
You can still add the 0.5 for a non-resident.
Under Act 205 you can, but not under the home rule charter. So anything that you levy under the home rule charter is on residents only. Anything that you levy under Act 205 can be residents and non-residents.
Say that last sentence again.
Pardon me?
Say that last sentence again.
So on the earned income tax that's levied under Act 205 for the purpose of pensions can be levied on residents and non-residents who work in Beaver Falls.
Okay.
So if they work in Beaver Falls and it's not collected in their home municipality, it can be levied on in Beaver Falls. So that's why you're collecting more tax. They call it a commuter tax because it's basically on people who commute to the Beaver Falls to work, right? And if they're not in another town that collects it in another community where they live, then Beaver Falls can collect it here. And that's why it's so much higher than in the ones you only collect on your city residents. Does that make sense? Or is that sufficiently confusing, huh? The mercantile tax and the business privilege tax, those cannot be adjusted because there's specific reasons that they're grandfathered in at the level that you have them, and they cannot be changed. Now, the local service tax, again, I'll defer to Michael. I'm not sure about the local service tax. Is that one that can be adjusted or not?
Well, I know that there's been some effort through legal channels. I mean, what I'm saying is I think you and I, Debbie, have spoken about an attorney that believes that it can be raised by home rule municipalities, but I'm not sure because it's paid by people that work in your community but don't necessarily live in your community.
Right.
So I would put that off the table as an option. I would just leave that alone under home rule as being a tax that gives you greater flexibility regarding rate. That doesn't, I don't think that's something to give serious consideration to.
So for our purposes and our discussions, mercantile, local service, and business privilege are probably not taxes that would be affected by a home rule charter. Any questions on any of those? So really what you're talking about, because the per capita and residence tax are probably going to stay where they are. So basically what you're talking about is deed transfer and earned income are the two that could be, and obviously we talked about real estate tax. So real estate tax, deed transfer, and earned income tax, the city portion, are those taxes that you would have the flexibility to remove the caps.
So we've talked about the earned income tax, the deed transfer tax. I know you were talking about that before. Maybe I wasn't paying careful attention, but that in other home rule charter cities, that goes up to be a significant source of additional income?
You know, so let me answer that in two parts. One, yes, you can adjust it upwards. So right now it's 0.5. You can make that a higher rate. Is it a significant source of income? You can see there it only generates about 47,000. Yes, in 2019 it was up around 54,000. But if you have something big that changes, that is sold, like if you have a commercial or industrial building that is sold, it could be a significant source of income.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. I mean, I'll give you an example. In Johnstown, they were considering it and it got voted down. And the next year, one of their huge manufacturers sold the business, and I think they would have netted something like, I don't know, $1 million or something. So it's not always a significant source of income, but it could be. Let's put it that way. So just some of our observations about revenue. It does not naturally increase. Real estate tax at this point only increases pretty much when you raise the millage rate. That's because your assessments are outdated. In the future, if they have current assessments and they go up routinely when values go up, that could change. But currently, the real estate tax is not increasing. It's pretty much stagnant. Again, I said the collection rate is relatively low. It's only 84%. That is a low collection rate. And, we've talked to council a little bit about some things that we think could be done. You do get, as you said, you do get some delinquent real estate tax collection by the county. It generates about $50,000 a year, sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on how aggressive they are at going after tax sales and some other things. But you're clearly at the mercy of the county and the Tax Claim Bureau about how active they are and how aggressive they are. We just went over the Act 511 taxes. They tend to increase pretty steadily. Business taxes generate about $262,000 a year, but a home rule charter will not do much at all for that. Basically, that's not going to be affected by a home rule charter. Sewer reimbursements are about $2.5 million. We have talked to council a little bit about some ideas we have about rate structure and the way that might be able to be adjusted, but it won't be part of this conversation. The city only collects about 5% of its revenue through fees, and the revenue increases on an average of 0.9 to 1% per year, which is not a big increase when you consider that some of the benefits and other costs that the city has increased at a lot higher rate than 0.9% or 1%.
So I had a question about that. The
Sure.
sewer rates, they can be increased though, correct?
Yep.
And because your report that you gave indicated that we collect on the low end of those and that was a potential for revenue.
It is. It definitely is. One of our recommendations was to look at all of the fees and to make sure that we're recouping the cost of the services that we provide and make sure that the fees cover this. But if you remember going back to my pie chart, it's only 5% of all the revenue. So even if you doubled the fees, it's really not going to generate a whole lot of income. I mean, we do think it's still worth doing and that the city should definitely cover the cost of providing services, but it's still not a big piece of that pie. The biggest pieces of the pie are the sewer revenue and the tax revenue that we just went over, the real estate tax and the Act 511. But we still think it's worth.
That's
I'm
what she
sorry.
was asking about, was the sewer, not fees, but the
Oh,
sewer.
the sewer. Okay, so that's reimbursable to the city. And like I said, we are talking to Mick and the council members a little bit about some things that could be done to look at the rate structure and the reimbursements to the city. So that is definitely something that we think the city could work on.
Where we're out of whack is we provide water treatment for communities outside of the city of Beaver Falls. And we haven't aggressively made that. We've sort of, you know how you get here in Beaver County with the little municipalities around, oh, can we help out instead of really making those fees. They get raised and then, but what they really need to be on is a steady increase to keep up with, the increases of cleaning your water, the, annual increases. And those are the kinds of things we haven't done a good job on those joint sewer user agreements. The other municipalities that use our water treatment. We did right the ship about 10 or 15 years ago. Even the city was losing money on the treatment plant, and that got rectified. And now you notice that your sewer bills constantly go up a little bit, and that's because they're now on a
they're breaking ship.
yeah, a fee schedule that those always go up to keep up with the increasing costs of doing what you need to do. But so that's one area where we could definitely do better, and we should change that.
Yeah, and we've talked to council a good bit about, and we have another meeting scheduled this month about that issue, because there's a whole science around rate structure and really trying to determine what the rates need to be and justifying what those rates are. And some of that is around the capital projects that have to be done and the upgrades and the infrastructure. And that's something that we really need to look at, and we're going to work with the city to try and make that happen. So that is definitely an area to look at.
When it says the city collects only 5% of its revenue fees, can you explain what that means?
Well, out of the entire, if I go back to, let me go back here a minute. If you go back to what are the sources of the city's revenue, this is what I was talking about. So that the fees, as you can see, only make up about 5% of the entire revenue base. So real estate taxes, Act 511 taxes, the transfers, which include those sewer fees that are transferred and reimbursed to the city, those are the biggest source of revenue. So fees are important, but they still only make up about 5% of the overall revenue picture.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
So just a couple last points on revenue, and then I'm going to look at expenses and then see if there's any additional questions that I haven't answered. So we talked about the city's 2020 budget. Let me talk about that just for a minute. We worked with the city on that, and we believe it's reasonable, that it was conservative, that the revenue projections were good. But the problem is that the city continues to exhibit what we call a structural deficit. So even though they've done their best to produce revenue that will cover all of the costs of operation, for most of those years, and going back to that other slide where you saw those negative years, for most years, there's still what we call a structural deficit. The revenues don't cover everything that they need to for operating. So that continues to be a problem. The long-term trend, again, as I said, is that the revenues only increase 0.9% a year, which really isn't very much. Part of that problem is the real estate taxes that don't increase, and the fact that they're such a big portion of the budget. The city's debt is about $766,000, and I did look at that because that was one of the questions. I looked at that today to see what the debt looked like, and there's really two big chunks of that. One is a bond that was refinanced in 2017. And the city owes about, let me pull that out, about 4.5 million on that. That was a refunding of old debt and then some new money, and 4.8 million the city owes. And then the $600,000, it was a note that was borrowed in 2019. And the debt service is, like I said, about 766,000. It's right around the limits that we like to see. There's a standard through the Government Finance Officers Association. They always say that, you know, they don't like to see debt for a municipality more than 8 or 10% of its overall budget. And that's right around where you are. You're right around, you know, 9 or 10%, depending on the year and the revenue. So you're probably at your debt limits. I wouldn't say that it's extreme, and I've certainly seen much higher debt than the city of Beaver Falls is carrying, because that was the question, do we have excessive debt? I wouldn't say that it's extreme, but it's right around the limit of the threshold where you would want to be. When you don't have any debt, I worry about it, because that means you're really not doing capital projects and infrastructure, facilities, roads, things like that. So carrying some debt is really not a bad thing, but the city's actually getting to kind of its limits on that.
In the report that you have, you mentioned unsupported debt services. Can you explain to me what that is? What does that mean?
Unsupported?
At the end of your proposal, there's at the very end, it says that, I think in 2021, the city's gonna have to begin unsupported debt service. And
Oh, I think that, so yeah, if I recall, I'm trying to remember what that was. So I think that the joint sewer fund was actually paying part of the debt, and they had paid off their portion of it, I think in 2020. I think that that's what that refers to. But a portion of the debt was actually being paid for capital improvements at the sewer plant, and that their support for that debt, I think, ends this year.
I thought that the sewer was only supported debt. Is that not correct?
Yeah, the sewer was this. So when the city refinanced and took out additional debt, some of those improvements, this is my understanding, and I can double check that, but I think some of the improvements, some of the money went to make some improvements. And so the sewer fund was paying back the city for some of the debt that was incurred. But that ends, I believe, this year. And I'd have to double check with Pam about that. But I think that support for the debt service ends. So it's all in the city now, I guess, is the way to look at it. The city would be paying the entire bill instead of the sewer treatment fund paying some of it.
What happened is one of the methods that you use to try to make your budget balance was with the joint sewer users, which had money was coming in, because as I said before, we've structured those rates to go up automatically, and that's been good. That's kept that fluid is what I'm saying, but not fluid, but solvent.
Solvent, yeah.
And so so their funding's been good, and so what we agreed to do, I mean, it's all within the city. The water treatment plant's part of the city.
Sure.
And the water treatment people said, well, we need this much money to improve our equipment, and then we'll pay that back. But then we said, well, to balance the budget, could you pay us a little more from that fund? And that's what happened. But then eventually that runs out. They pay
They paid off their portion.
they pay off their portion of
Right.
capital improvements, and then, so you're
Right.
taking a short-term thing to get over the hump in a year, but then that catches up with you eventually.
Right.
That's a story that's ongoing.
Yeah, and I think that's what we were referring to, is that that debt becomes city debt when it's not supported any longer by those subsidies that were coming from the joint sewer or the treatment plant. So moving on along, the general long-term trend is, we're talking about population decline, some declining assessments until there's new assessments, and all of those things that I've just talked about, the demographics and some of the other issues that I pointed out. It's creating challenges, for public officials and staff. And so we're all in this together and kind of looking for solutions as we move forward, both on the revenue side, but also on the cost containment side as we move forward on that. So before I go to expenses, does anyone have anything else they want to talk about on the revenue side?
The public safety and parking revenue, can you break that down, the sources?
You mean these here?
The public safety and parking revenues, yeah. They were listed in this. report.
The public safety revenue sources?
Public safety and parking revenue.
Okay, the parking revenue is meters and permits. I know that. The public safety revenue, let me pull it out real quick here.
One thing, I can fill one piece in, because we have the housing projects in the city, the housing organization, I'm doing a bad job on my names tonight, Beaver County Housing Authority, they actually help, and since those areas tend to use public safety resources, let's say, at a higher rate than the ordinary population, the housing authority has agrees with the city every year to contribute money to the city budget. So that's one source of revenue on the public safety side.
And we also get
Yeah, there's also contracts with some of the surrounding communities. There's Eastvale, West Mayfield,
Yep, good, thanks, Jerry.
and some other reimbursements that the police get, I think, when
Yeah.
they do provide services for the school districts and
Yes,
utility companies. There's some police reimbursements in there also. And as you said, housing authority reimbursements. Yeah, the parking is primarily meters and permits. I don't see, yeah. And there's other things like police reports. There's smaller things too that kind of go in those fees.
What is intergovernmental? Is this police contracts with other boroughs?
Now, intergovernmental is actually things that come from the state. So for instance, the state aid that the city gets for pensions is run through that. They get some for the fire departments. That is run through there. There is a PennDOT snow removal agreement. There is public utility realty tax that goes through there, alcohol beverage tax. And the city also gets a little bit from gas well fees. And those all come from the state pretty much. And so they're called intergovernmental because they're basically transferring revenue from the state to the city.
Do our police contract with other boroughs?
Yes,
And does that bring in revenue?
yes.
Yeah, that East Valley and West Mayfield are the two that I'm showing.
And can that be raised?
It could be,
It's by contract, you have to negotiate.
yeah.
And does it seem like it's a reasonable amount that or is it plausible that could?
It's-
fair?
I think our people feel that it's reasonable. We might be able to pull it up a little bit, but it's not gonna wind up being a huge additional source of revenue.
So they try to estimate the number of hours you might spend in each community and figure out the cost for that.
The city also gets some reimbursements from the school district for the treasurer's office and for the, is it the school district or the county? I'd have to look that up. But you get it on crossing guard wages. So you get some reimbursements from other governments where you're providing the services. Anything else on revenue?
I have a question. What are the other financing sources? They're bringing in average about $500,000 a year, but that's a pretty good chunk for an other.
Yeah, and that's that is typically some interfund transfers. So for instance, the city gets what's called liquid fuel funds that they keep in a different fund, and then they transfer that once a year. So that's part of that. It's like, let me see. Liquid fuels is about $272,000. There's like the sale of property when the city may sell off police cars or other types of property. That's in there. There's some from the joint sewer users and the city sewer users. Some of that is reported in other financing sources. Refunds of other prior year expenses. So if the city actually gets a refund from something that they spent from a prior year, that goes in there. And then the big chunk of it in 2019 was that proceeds from loans, that $600,000 loan was reported in that category.
That was
So yeah, it can be a pretty big category depending on what is run through those line items. And obviously we aggregate them to make them more readable and knowable, but there's a lot of detail. You could get down to the actual line items in our reports. So moving on to expenses, I'll try to not keep you here all night. You can see that the city has really done a pretty good job of keeping its expenses within its revenues. It's been difficult from year to year, but the problem is that the expenses, even when they're only increasing at 1.15% over the past 5 years, that's still increasing at a faster pace than the revenue, because remember the revenue was around 0.9. So even if you keep your expenses at only 1.15 per year increase, you still have a problem where there's going to be a gap. So it's been a huge challenge for the city to really continue or to maintain all of the operations and all the operating costs within that revenue, because the revenue is just not expanding. Personnel costs, debt service, energy costs, all of those things drive the expenses. Insurance and benefits are huge, and within those benefits are those pension amounts that we talked about that are over $1 million a year. And then you have all of your health insurance, other insurances and benefits that go in that category. The police department is, so that's the insurance and benefits category is the largest category with 21% of the budget. The police department's the second largest category, almost the same size, with 1.5 million or 20% of the budget. Public Works is the third largest category. And then our note is that cost containment, as I said, has been pretty good, but the revenues just don't keep up with the expenditures. And it's just very difficult to stay within that revenue profile that we just looked at. Here's the pie chart on expenditures. You can see the police are at 20%, fire at 10%, sanitation, which is the garbage collection, 7%, public works at 15%, the code department is only at 1%, water pollution control, or what we call the sewer department, is at 6%. You can see that the debt there is at 8%, and insurance and benefits is a big chunk at 21%. The general government pretty much covers the manager's office and administration, also covers tax collection, treasurer's office, legal fees, engineering fees, building, costs of running the building. So there's a lot that goes in the general government category. This goes down into more detail where you can actually see from year to year, from 2016, 17, 18, 19. I put only 4 years up here, so it would not be overwhelming, but you can see the total expenditures are slightly higher than the total revenue, and that's where you get those deficits. You know, we were looking at, I think, 8.5 to 8.7 million, and on the expenditure side, we're looking more towards, you know, the $9 million level on the expenditures. And again, under insurance and benefits, I added the pensions back in just so that it would be consistent over the 4-year period. But it's a pass-through. It doesn't help the general fund except to pay the pension obligation. Here's some of our observations. The sanitation expenses increased at a rate of about 5%. That's the garbage collection, solid waste. Police expenditures at a rate of about 1.6. Public Works at 2.6. So you can see, even though these are relatively good rates of increase, it's still increasing faster than the revenue is increasing. Debt service, as I said, is about 8 to 10% of the budget. So it's pretty much at the maximum that you would want to see it. There's no legal limit, but as I said, the government finance officer standard recommends less, 10% or less. Building costs have been increasing somewhat. And again, the city's done a good job of containing costs, but it's still less than the rate of revenue increase. So our conclusions were that there's no imminent crisis. We felt that 2020 budget was reasonable and that the city had enough cash and cash reserves to meet their expectations for this year, this fiscal year. But the projections indicate that there will definitely continue to be deficits unless there's some changes made along the way, either in the area of revenue generation or cost containment. Revenue is expected to increase again at only 1% a year. Expenditures are increasing at about 2.5% in our projections. There will have to be initiatives and intervention in 2020 and 2021, or there could be a fiscal emergency if the city would ultimately run out of their cash reserves. So it's important to identify revenue sources, cost containment in all the departments. And then we made a few key recommendations, and I'll go over these very briefly because I wanted to make sure that if there are any other questions, you guys have an opportunity to discuss. But we talked about increasing the current real estate tax collection. If we could get it up which would be wonderful to get it up to 95, but even if we could get it up to 90% collection rate, we think that you would have more operating cash at an earlier time period where it would be essential to be used for current operating costs. We think that you should look at the delinquent tax collection. Again, like I said, the Tax Claim Bureau has been a little bit erratic in how they deliver your money and how aggressive they are. And you could look into hiring a private collector that might be a bit more aggressive. We talked about amusement fees and raising some of these mechanical device fees. That's not going to generate a whole lot of revenue, but sometimes it's an easy fix to bring in a few more dollars. We've been talking to council a little bit about stormwater management fees. A lot of communities are imposing these kinds of fees for stormwater management because the city has some obligations around that and some regulations through the DEP that they have to meet. And to have a fee might help them to offset some of those costs. Looking at all the fees, we talked about that earlier, looking at the cable TV franchise fee. So we had some recommendations around raising money, and as I said, we're going to continue to talk to council and help assist, provide technical assistance to talk about fee structures and the ability of the city to be reimbursed. And one of the things I'll say, loud to everyone is one of the reasons we like the fees, especially stormwater management sewer fees, is because everybody pays them. Nobody's tax exempt or fee exempt. So everybody pays stormwater fees, everybody pays sewer fees, whereas your real estate tax, about a third of your property is tax exempt. So everybody's not paying everything. So again, it helps to spread the pain around if you have a variety of fees and ways to include helping to support the city operation. And then we just had a few on the cost containment side, the use of part-time police officers, the increasing employee contributions for healthcare. Our big one was, as we talked about a little earlier, trying to restructure the way the city sewer and the joint sewer collection and reimbursements are done. And then just looking at paid leave. And some of these things you can only look at when you're doing collective bargaining. You can't really do them arbitrarily or unilaterally. You have to really look at what your collective bargaining agreements provide and then determine whether or not you can achieve any savings by having a more effective collective bargaining. And this just summarizes both the revenue and the expenditures. And again, we don't think the city, and this is just our conclusion, we don't think that the city is in any imminent danger, but we do think that right around the corner in 2021 and possibly a little later, there's going to be significant uncertainty as to whether the city could remain solvent unless they make some changes. This process that you're involved with is a very, very important part of that process because it could give the city not only flexibility in the taxing rates, but it could give the city the ability to structure itself in the way that is most efficient and most effective and provides the best services that you can for your residents. So I will stop there, take questions or invite discussion. You know, it's a lot.
Nice job, Debbie.
Question, just again, the right on the screen there, number 22 that you just had up.
Oh, sure.
Yes, let's see here. And unsupported debt service will begin. And I know you explained what that is and I understand it. What's the impact? Are we talking like, I mean, is this going to add expenditures of $10,000 or $100,000 or, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I would have to look back, but my recollection is it was about $250,000.
So right now, the debt service is about $776,000. It would be adding $200,000 to that.
Well, it was basically the 250,000 was offsetting that 760 some.
Okay, okay.
So the city will be responsible for the full debt service moving forward. Unless they can negotiate again, with the joint sewer. I mean, like I said, we're looking at a number of different things in terms of restructuring and reimbursement, and it's very complex and very, sensitive politically to the city and the other communities. So we want to tread carefully. There's a whole science around how those rates are established and how those reimbursements can be set up. We really want to be careful and, work with the city to make those decisions. But yes, unfortunately, that support for that debt service right now will end, and the city will be on its own to pay the debt service.
The city manager line, it lists it at somewhere around 200,000. What, is there a breakdown to that, or is that Joan's wages, or those include his benefits? I mean,
Yes, if you go to the detail, like I said, in our full report, we have every single line item as the appendix in that report. So you could really go down to office supplies and every single line item. But I can tell you, you're talking about the executive department, there's the manager, there's benefits, there's the audit, there's copy machine supplies, telephone, postage, printing, the part-time accountant. There's a whole bunch of stuff that is included in that particular category. And I might be able to, let me get out of here. I could probably put that up on the screen. Let me see if I have that. Yeah, I don't know if you can see that. It's probably pretty small on your screen. But yeah, we could go to any category here and look up any particular line item that you're interested in. But, so yeah, in the executive, there's the manager, the city clerk, the secretary, community development director, sick days, longevity, supplies, copy machine. So there's about, 15, 20 line items within that category. Same with financial administration. There's the treasurer's office and all the treasurer's, expenses. And we have like, I think 6 or 7 years in there. So you could really go in and look at any of this. There's tax collection and all the commissions that are paid for tax collection. There's solicitor and engineer. So there's different categories. Like I said, just for purposes of this presentation, we sort of aggregate them into general topics so that you can get a better idea of what those look like.
Are there any limitations on rental registration fees or fines in that category? What would be collected?
So in general, you're supposed to collect only what it costs you to provide the service. So, that's somewhat subjective. So if it takes a clerk, if there's postage and printing and the hours that are spent by the clerk to input that information, and then you divide that up by the number of, registrations that you process. So again, there's a way to analyze that. If you go too high, you could get challenged that you're collecting more than what it costs you to provide the service. But the general rule is that you are allowed to charge for any service what it costs you to deliver that service. So, back to the police contracts. Again, if you put everything into the actual calculation of what it costs you to provide that service, you would put part of the police station overhead, you would put vehicles, you would put, replacement of vehicles, computer equipment. but chances are you're not putting all of those things in. And if you did, it would be so high that it wouldn't be attractive for other communities to contract with you. So there's a balancing act in terms of setting those fees and making sure that they're still attractive enough that someone will want to provide those contracts.
So almost 2/3 of the budget appears to be the police, fire, and public works, and their associated insurance and benefits. Are they considering cuts in these areas? Is it something that's being discussed? Anybody?
Well, are you're required by some,
Yeah, some of it is, I mean, let's face it, in all of these categories, the primary driver is personnel, people. It's not paving supplies, it's not the police cars, it's personnel. So the blatant fact is we're talking then people, a reduction in people or a reduction in the wages and income of those people. And so up to this point, we have not tried to go that direction. We've tried to, some of it you're bound to by third-class city code, but you know, obviously we've tried to manage that. Now we've had people, the street department is not operating at the full complement of men. There's been some recycling out of police officers. So some officers with seniority that are at the top of the pay scale are being replaced with people coming in at the bottom and making less. So there are those kinds of things going on, but we haven't come in and said, okay, we're gonna slash positions here. People are gonna start.
But is that the intent of with this home rule charter? Because then you'll be able to do that.
No.
you can do it now too,
No, I'm
in
not.
some regards.
Right, I would not be saying that the point of home rule charter is to reduce personnel. I'm much more interested, because I think her report bears this out, that we're not being outrageous in terms of what our expenditures are, but they are out of whack with income. And one of the key reasons for that is we're using a static income generator, which is property tax. And that's not being reassessed on an annual basis. So that's just staying right there. Meanwhile, your costs are going up 2% a year, and you're not able to generate that. If we can flip this and say, let's fairly go to raise that income tax percentage, people's income are tending to go up more in those rates that we're seeing that our rates are going up. Why? Because we're paying people, everybody's paying everybody raises of 1%, 2%, 3%.
Cost of living.
Cost of living increases. And so if we could get the income moving up with those costs on that cost of living, then it allows you to be paying people that cost of living and not losing that. So that's what I'm more interested in doing than in, you know, some of those other things that we're bound to. And by the way, most of those things were found to more by contracts with unions than we are by third-class city code.
Is that,
And that's actually the point I wanted to make, is that most of your employees are involved in a or a member of a collective bargaining agreement and a union. So Home Rule Charter doesn't interfere with those arrangements or those agreements at all. Everything that you do still has to be, in terms of compensation and benefits, still has to be bargained with your bargaining unions. We did in our reports, because we have separate reports for every department. And again, those are public information. You're welcome to look at those or have those. But we have recommendations for every single department and every single function in the city. And some of them are cost saving, recommendations, but some of them are not. Some of them are basically just to improve the quality of the services. But I would agree with what you just said, because the thing you want to do, have to support city services. They're important, they're critical, they're things that people depend on, and you want to have quality city services. But you want to find the fairest, most uniform, most consistent way to pay for those services. And some of it is being able to have the flexibility of using real estate when you need to, EIT when you need to, deed transfer maybe, and then a whole series of fees that apply to everyone equally. So you want to have a whole array of things that you can tap into when you have to support critical, important city services. And that's the whole point of Home Rule Charter, is to give the local residents and officials the ability to make that decision at the local level.
Do we create the administrative code, or how does that work?
So you only do the administrative code if the charter passes, right? And the administrative code basically fills in the blanks of all of the things that are in the Home Rule Charter. So for instance, if you are going to require a personnel system based on merit and, non-political or whatever you decide to put in the charter, the admin code would actually create that system, that personnel system. So you only deal with the admin code if the charter is adopted.
I have one last question. I actually have lots of questions, but I'll ask this one. Did you guys ever consider going to self-funded health insurance, higher deductibles?
We have definitely considered going up with the employee increases in their participation in healthcare. And I do think that's a place where, speaking personally, I think we've been, we could be more aggressive than we have been.
Did you say self-funded?
I'm not saying self-funded. I'm saying, what I'm saying is contributions to healthcare, not self-funded healthcare.
Very risky for
Yeah.
municipality.
Yeah, you get one person gets cancer and it wipes that out.
Sure.
Any other questions? Michael, before we adjourn, could you just remind me who you have as the guest speaker for our next Zoom meeting, which is October 15th?
Yes, I have lined up Howard Bednar, who is the city manager for the city of Clairton. They have been a home rule community since 1990, and Howard has been the municipal manager probably for at least 10, 12, maybe 15 years, working under that home rule structure. So he's open to, he'll be available on Zoom, and he's available to answer any and all questions and talk about the structure of home rule in Clareton and the role of the manager and other department heads and the role of council and the city's ability that they're implementing a higher earned income tax on residents under home rule. And he's open to discussion and your questions based upon, what he's saying and, things you want to know more about. And Clareton represents a municipality, a third-class city that shifted from your commission form of government to something that's not drastic. It's not extreme. It's basically a shift in the role of council that now they're policymakers and decision makers. They're no longer directors of departments of the respective operations like you oversee. So you can probe and inquire more about that with Howard and how that's working. And I'll help facilitate discussion and ask questions to get the dialogue going. And then, I'm sure you'll come up with some very intelligent and inquisitive and insightful questions. So I told him to be available around 7 o'clock on October 15 by Zoom.
Do you want us to initiate a link, or is that going to come from your end?
You could send it to me. Go ahead, Debbie.
Yeah, I've been doing the second Thursday, so I can send that out for that meeting.
Thank you very much.
I already have them set up, so I might as well send them out.
If you don't have Howard's email,
You can just forward it to him.
yes, exactly. But he's on board and he's happy to do it. He's looking forward to it.
Great.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, both of you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Very much. This presentation was exactly what I was looking for.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yep.
Great job, Debbie.
Debbie, thank you.
So if you guys think of, I know with me, I always go home and think, I should have asked that. Shoot me an email. And like I said, I have so much financial information that I've gathered over the past year or so that probably anything that you have that we didn't get to or that you think about later, just shoot me an email and I'll send the answer out to everyone.
There's no more questions?
I actually have one.
No, go ahead. This is
I
completely
haven't really gotten follow-up with anybody since I wrote that letter, and I just wanted, because from my perspective, it feels like a number of you came into this already with the conclusion that you were in favor of home rule. And so my question is it your intention to study this to write it, or are we studying it to decide whether this is a good fit? Because I think it helps me clarify where I fit in this group, what my purpose is, what your agenda is. Because it feels like from observation, that you guys already have kind of come to a conclusion that it's a good fit. Like you wanted to start writing it.
Yes.
Meeting in.
Yeah, I'll admit, the only reason I'm here is to write a home rule charter. Because I think that's, and I think, as I've said many times, that's not pulling a fast one on anybody, because we have to show the residents of the city of Beaver Falls, here's another possibility. And we've looked at this and we think this would be a better possibility than staying the way we are. And so I don't want to vote not to produce a home rule charter, because if we say, oh, we've looked at it and we don't think we ought to go that way, let's let the residents decide. Let's create the best thing that we can create, and then let the city residents decide whether they want to go or they don't, or they want to stay with the status quo. And they can stay with the status quo. So we're not pulling, we're not doing anything behind anybody's back or anything.
But I think what we have to do, I thought.
I was going to say, can I just interject one thing? The commission is required within 9 months of your initiation or the vote, you're required to take a vote as to whether you want to go forward and write a charter or not.
And that's fine. I don't have any problem with that. We should do that and take that vote. I'm just telling you right now, this is the way I'm going to vote, because this is what I want to do. I want to create a new a new possibility and then let the voters decide whether they would want to go with that.
I thought that 2 or 3 months ago, the commission did take a vote to move toward drafting a home rule charter.
No,
We did
We
not.
really didn't do
No,
that,
we
no.
No.
Okay, it seemed like a vote, but I think you need to do it.
Safe to address.
Again, you have 9 months from the date of your election to take a formal vote to move toward the drafting of a home rule charter.
So what happened was, from that date,
But we got sworn in.
whatever date that was, we have 9 months from that date to offer an opinion.
Yeah.
But somewhere along the line, someone offered or mentioned that we'd like to have this on the ballot in November.
You have next year.
Next year.
2021.
Oh, okay, not 20.
No.
No.
Right.
Okay.
We had no clue even, well,
Yeah.
I shouldn't say we, because maybe somebody did.
No,
I had no clue even what anything was. I was like, what did I just do?
Mhm.
But
You
we
know,
also
'cause I
have
was
an
just lost.
obligation, I think, as a group, to look at other options, see what we could come up with, or, offer opinions. Doug has his opinion, he wants to move right into writing that charter. But I don't know that all 7 of them do.
Right.
And that's what Faith is, I'm kind of leaning on Faith's, her opinions of what's available for the city. This presentation tonight, it really opened my eyes.
Mhm.
And it does offer a bleak picture, although we're not we're not that bad off. But we don't see in the city any other ways of generating revenue over the next couple of years.
She does give recommendations.
There's
Yeah, there are.
So,
And let me just say too, that is the whole purpose of this first 6 or 8 months until you take an official vote. The purpose is to actually explore, to see, as Faith actually asked, what are the advantages? Are there disadvantages? Are there challenges? Are there things that we should consider? And if we're going to do a charter, which way are we going to go? Are we going to go, with the council manager form? Are we going to go for some other form of government? So this is the opportunity that you have to really dig in, and this interview, like Michael just set up, is really going to be so valuable. And I'm going to try, I think between the two of us, we're going to try and find you some other people to talk to too. That would be informative and would give you the ability to ask all your questions. One thing I did want to touch on, I know it's getting late, but if you had asked about what are the advantages and disadvantages of Act 47, and you don't want to go there. You really don't. I mean, we could talk about that a little bit, and Michael and I work with Act 47 communities regularly. But 2 things. You in order to be in Act 47, the city would actually have to petition the state to do that, and the state would come in and do an investigation to see if you met 11 different criteria. So there's 11 criteria, and I could send those out to you, but you have to have missed payroll, you have to have missed a pension payment, or have 3 or 4 years of structural deficits. There's about 11 different criteria, so it's a really serious step, and you honestly are not going to probably meet any of those criteria at this point. So in terms of Act 47 being an option of some kind, I don't think you want to think about that or go there.
Well, the only reason I bring it up is
No,
because
I think it's a good question.
part of the presentation. I mean, it was almost in a threat form, like if we don't do this,
Yeah.
Act 47 will come in. And so that is why I asked for that information.
And ironically enough, almost every recovery plan that Debbie and I are involved in recommends forming a home rules charter, forming a home rule government study commission to look at the benefits of home rule. And some of the communities like Clareton have utilized the home rule charter flexibility and additional powers to help graduate to come out of Act 47.
Absolutely. I mean, that you can't emphasize that strong enough, because that's one of the things that, you know, is so helpful to these communities is, one, to be able to decide what positions you want to continue to enjoy. And I know you said, Doug, that you don't want to talk about positions, but there are positions like controller and treasurer and some others. And, you know, we've talked about financial management and having a professional finance officer, and that is really, really important. And you can write that stuff into your charter. If you think that having a finance officer is an important, and we have recommended that, so I am biased in that regard.
1,000% behind that, by the way.
I know you
I was
are.
thinking of
I know you are. But you can write that right into, yeah, you can write that right into your
I'm
charter.
1,000% behind that. That has to be done
So, and those are things that
for the city.
ultimately, those are things that are going to control your costs too and enhance your revenue by having the right people in the right position. So there's a whole array of things that Act 47 communities use and we use as tools to help them to get out of, you know, distress.
Okay, to answer your question, I, like you, like to know everything about a thing before I make a decision. So like whether it's like literally I researched air purifiers for an hour last night. Like, okay, so I would never come into a situation like this with a decision if I didn't already have knowledge. Like Doug has lots of knowledge ahead of time. So he already knew that kind of stuff that we don't know yet. But you know, I don't know about you guys, but the more I hear, the more this makes sense, and the more you know, the more that I research on my own and hear from everybody and answer questions or listen to questions, it seems to be making it more and more clear. So I feel like we are moving towards a decision, but I don't think most of us came in with a decision already made. Anyway, you have a question back there?
Yeah, other than the ability to raise earned income tax, what are the other major benefits of going to home rule? I don't hear where it sounds like there's going to be any other changes to the city structure other than the ability to
That's because
raise taxes.
all we talked about tonight was finances.
Okay.
A week ago, we spent the whole meeting on structure, the structure of the way the third-class city code prescribes that you have the number of council members that we have, a mayor, you know, how everything's done that way. And so I would say the two key things that we're looking at are a change in structure, particularly to do what she just mentioned, and that is, right now, we have lots of different people with a piece on the finance. Yes, exactly. Yes, and then we also need, they're recommending, and I'm hearing that, this idea that what's your name, Michael? That Michael just talked about, that the guy from Clairton's going to talk about, is that moving from having your council members be directors of certain departments to having your council be more of a policy body and having your city manager carry out the policy that you establish rather than kind of,
So would there be the need to add directors that you guys are currently doing, or would the city manager take over as director of everything?
Right, I think that's, I mean, that's what we're talking about. So I don't have a good answer. That's a question I want to talk to the guy from Clairton about. How did they set it up and what advantages? And it seems to me like it probably does consolidate power in the city manager, and so we'll see. But that's to me, so far,
where's the mayor?
Well, that's what we're going to talk about. Yeah, where does the mayor fit in to? Do you have a strong mayor? Do you have a mayor? You can even eliminate mayor if you want to. You can have just a council, a pure council. and no mayor at all. But,
And mutiny.
yeah,
You know, and keep in mind too, that you're gonna have a whole public education process once you're comfortable with what your decision is. And once you start to write your charter, when you get it into draft format, you've got a whole public education process that you're gonna have to go through, because these things are not adopted without a lot of knowledge and information and people being comfortable with your decision.
There's a big old document that Michael made for us that kind of really detailed, breaks apart all those options. And I believe it's probably on the Facebook page, right? Yeah, it's been posted on the Facebook page. So if you really want to dig into it, yeah, you can find that.
It's a comparison matrix for third-class city code, home rule council manager, mayor, council mayor, and it's 3 columns. And it breaks it down, you know.
Well, I remember when I was living in Allegheny County when they went to the,
oh, very good.
Oh, good.
yeah, when they went to the chief executive from the county council and all that.
Yeah, very good.
County commissioners.
We spent 2 meetings on that. looking at that. So, yeah, but I'm still, I don't think I have enough information.
We're not done.
I think maybe after I talk with Howard and hear what he says, then maybe I might know if I'm leaning more. But right now, I'm still like, we're.
Still learning.
Any more questions? You have any more questions?
No.
You good, Michael?
Can we call it a night?
Thanks
Yeah.
for asking.
I have a quick question, Michael. I move we adjourn.
Second.
Whoa, whoa,
Whoa,
whoa,
whoa,
whoa.
it's very
All right, she
enthusiastic.
gets it. You got it last time.
Thank you both for
Thank
your
you very
time,
much.
and
That was
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
That says a lot.
Thank
wait,
you.
Question. The oh yeah, no, you guys are good. Thanks.
Thank you,
Yeah, right.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you very much.
Good night.
Good night.
Be well.